means it's comfy and it protects my mattresses, which is a huge relief.
And as any parent knows, the most important part of a mattress protector is protecting against stains and moisture. My little guy's pretty good when he's awake, but nighttime is a toss-up, and that's okay. Accidents happen.
No more mystery stains on your nice mattress. The Purple Protector is waterproof and water absorbent, which will keep your mattress dry and clean. It protects the top and the sides of your mattress, so no matter what spills or leaks out of your family members, you'll know your mattress and your warranty are safe. It's stain resistant, so I can just throw the protector in the wash and it's good as new. I wish I could do that to my husband.
It's hypoallergenic and non-toxic, and it's resistant to dust mites, which can be a problem in the forest.
It's cool and breathable, which means no more waking up sweaty and damp like a Wookiee's armpit.
I even have one on my bed. It's so comfy, I can forget it's even there.
So when Junior gets scared and joins me in bed, I can rest easy knowing my mattress is protected. It even comes with its own 10-year warranty. What a sweetie.
Being a mom can be so fulfilling, and the Purple Protector gives me one less thing to worry about. If you or your little monster sleep, click now to protect your mattress. Order your stretchy, soft, waterproof, stain-resistant Purple Protector today. You'd better believe it's real.
Good morning.
Hello everyone, I'm Kevin, always known as Forum BX257, here to bring you another 1980s G.I. Joe tour review. And for this second Navy theme month, I'll be taking a look at the Cobra Underwater Elite Trooper, the 1988 Hydro Vipers, sometimes known as the Demons of the Deep. Now, the Hydro Vipers don't make any cartoon appearances, but they make their first comic book appearance in the Ulmova comic run of G.I. Joe in issue number 81. Where they're not shown in their full and very distinctive outfit, unfortunately. As a matter of fact, on that subject, the Hydro Vipers are actually quite a memorable figure, although they're so bizarre in a way that a lot of people who remember them actually don't remember them being part of the G.I. Joe line.
First, we'll take a look at the Hydro Vipers accessories. Taking a look at his dagger. Very interesting lightning bolt shape. Also take a look at his harpoon gun. Now, as you just saw, I had the harpoon gun kind of attached to the bottom, this bottom knob here. I don't think it's actually supposed to go there, but the trigger actually fits in there really well. And, well, to be honest, the figure doesn't actually have a second hand in order to hold the second accessory, but I'll get into that a bit later. Next, he comes with a regulator mask. Just unplug these standard G.I. Joe hoses. The mask isn't a complete helmet, and it does fit on his head very oddly. You kind of have to angle it on there before placing it on. or else it just kind of sits on a funny angle. Of course, he comes with 2 of these standard hoses, which fit onto his scuba backpack. They have pegs for the hoses just right on the top there. The standard hoses, which are about 3 inches long, are kind of awkward to get from the backpack to his mask. So there are several ways you can do it. I just had them wrapped under his arms like this, but you can just have them wrapped around like that, but they kind of stick out quite a bit from the side. So that's why I have it wrapped underneath there, just so he has kind of a lower profile with the hoses don't snag onto anything else. And last but not least, he comes with a pair of what the contents list on the car calls fathom fins, basically swim fins or flippers. They're a really rubbery material, and they look very organic, demon-like in fact, with that strange leathery texture. And speaking of strange leathery textures, he also comes with a devil ray. It's a type of manta ray with a barbed tail. It's actually a very good representation too. A lot of tiny details like the little fins at the back, and just the way the eyes sort of bug out like that. And now to discuss the Hydro Viper's most distinctive feature, his left hand. It's a non-usable left hand, unfortunately, but it's webbed. A lot of collectors actually remember the webbed hand on this action figure when they don't even remember that the Hydro Viper was part of the G.I. Joe series. It's just that memorable. And while it may seem odd for them to do that, it actually goes very well with the rest of the details on the figure, which I'll discuss in just a bit. But it also goes with the explanation that this guy is surgically and maybe even genetically modified. It's clearly distinguished on the file card, and while it may seem a bit far-fetched for Hasbro to do that, you do have to remember that that is something that Hasbro had actually done with Cobra before. The Strato Viper from 1986 was modified just for high altitude, and let's face it, Serpentor was a clone, so that's really where all this sort of stuff comes from. As a matter of fact, some people have even said that the modification of this figure might have actually been inspired by Mara from the Sunbow G.I. Joe cartoons, who was modified to the point where she couldn't actually leave the water. And while the webbed hands is very, well, just sort of creepy and monstrous, there are all sorts of other little cues on him as well. Like this bit over his face, which almost looks like a regular mask just by itself, has kind of an odd opening, kind of like a puffer fish or something, or catfish. Then he has these little leathery bits all over him, as well as on his feet here, which I believe are really supposed to be an extension of the flippers. So that's a nice bit of continuity of the sculpt there. Because again, sometimes the people who did the sculpt for the accessories were not necessarily the same people who did the sculpt for the figure itself. So I always count it as really nice when that sort of thing flows very well together. Obviously, he has his rather non-practical looking mask. This is really where he gets that sort of Demon of the Deep nickname, I'm assuming. And of course, it's also very interesting that he even comes with a pet manta ray on top of that. Something that, to me, always seemed a bit less like Cobra and more like another organization, which I'll get to in a bit. And speaking of in a bit, one very interesting thing is the symbol on his arm here is not a Cobra symbol. I thought it might be like a stylized Cobra symbol or something, but to me it just looks so much more like, I don't know, like a beetle or something, which has led a lot of people to think that the design for the Hydro Viper might not have started out as a Cobra figure at all. Like the 1988 Iron Grenadiers Nullifier pilot, a lot of collectors believe that the Hydro Viper started off life as a recycled Cobra Law design. A lot of that organic look on him translates very well to the other two, and the color scheme also matches very well with these other two Cobra Law figures. I suppose by 1988 Hasbro wanted a new Cobra Underwater Trooper, but you have to admit that the 1985 Cobra Eels are probably the most memorable for that role, even though the Hydro Viper is actually quite memorable just because of how he looks. On top of that, the Hydro Viper, of course, has a different name. They could have simply called the Hydro Viper a new version of the Eels, but they didn't. And on top of that, he is actually listed as the Elite Trooper. So one would think that these guys would just be like the standard Navy, whereas these guys would be kind of the Navy SEALs of the group. Now, I know a lot of collectors really dismiss the Hydro Viper because of his looks, and even though his looks are kind of explained on his file card as being part of his genetic and synthetic modification, you do still have to realize that, well, look at what came before. A very technological looking Frogman, and even guys like the Strato Viper and the Star Viper, who are modified as well, do not look like the creature from the Black Lagoon because of it, whereas this guy does. But I think that part of his look is actually psychological, basically psychological warfare. You do have to remember that the sea is something that's filled with the unknown, and because of that, a lot of sailors become a little bit superstitious. So can you imagine something like this guy popping out of the blue, or seeing this guy for the first time, and him shooting his harpoon gun at you? That would be scary, and that's the point. As far as who a rival would be for the Hydro Viper, it's actually easy to say that any of the G.I. Joe sailors would actually been able to fight against this guy. But if you want an example of a scuba diver, you would have, of course, guys like the 1986 Wetsuit, who is admittedly a little bit old for this guy. But just the following year, after the Hydro Viper's release, we do have a new version of Deep Six, who is admittedly not a scuba diver, but a deep sea diver. But still, you can still see these guys fighting against each other, where the Eels might fear to tread. The Hydro Viper would, of course, be able to go far down deeper to where Deep Six would be able to go. There are a couple of things that I kind of wish they had done with the figure. One of them is, well, mostly his chest. As you can see in the original card artwork, that chest would have actually have been black. And they just sort of skipped that paint app, which, I mean, granted, with all these accessories on him, he looks great, but without them, he's just that plain sort of purple color, and it looks kind of washed out and kind of, well, boring without it. I think that black vest would have really made the figure kind of pop, even without the accessories. Another very interesting thing about the card art is that it actually shows storage for his harpoon gun on his leg. Like, the harpoon gun is specifically behind that very circular piece on his leg, which is right there. There is no peg, and there is no way of attaching the harpoon gun onto his leg. As a matter of fact, I don't think he would want to, because the way it would have attached, it would have actually had gone past his foot, so he wouldn't have actually been able to stand up straight if he had the harpoon gun attached to his foot anyway. I think the Hydro Viper makes a very interesting army builder, because even though I have said that he looks a little bit plain without all of his accessories, And if you're army building him, you're probably getting a few of these guys without, a complete accessory list. He still does look very good with a lot of the later Cobra aquatic vehicles and playsets. In the same year that Hydro Viper was released, we also have the 1988 Battle Barge. And he is actually shown on the Battle Barge package. And he does look very good in it. His red actually does match very well with the dark red that the Battle Barge has here. And of course, I have two other Cobra figures which have that distinctive purple outfit as well. So that's not just something that the Cobra Law figures have. The regular Cobra figures actually did have that same sort of coloring as well. And then, of course, we have most collectors' favorite pairing of the Hydro Viper and a vehicle, the 1987 Sea Ray. Of course, he fits right on the bottom there. And again, because it's a peg system, you can't actually put his scuba tanks on him. But he looks great on there nonetheless. And of course, this vehicle is yet another one which is home to a figure, the Sea Slug, who has, again, the same type of purple. While the Battle Barge and the Sea Ray are really good choices for pairing up the Hydro Viper with, personally, I think their somewhat grayish color scheme might actually go a little bit better with the 1985 Eels than it does with the Hydro Viper. So this is actually my pick for what to put the Hydro Viper on. It's the 1986 Hydro Sled. Very appropriate name. And at least here we have tons of room for his Devil Ray and his extra accessories. And of course, he can keep his scuba tanks on while using it. If you're looking for a Hydro Viper on the aftermarket, you shouldn't have to pay all that much because he is a fairly well-produced figure. He isn't particularly popular. Even as an army builder, most people still build more of the Eels than they do of this guy. And on top of that, his accessories, while there are quite a lot of them, making it fairly hard to find a complete Hydro Viper, they're still actually very sturdy accessories, and the figure itself is a fairly sturdy figure too. You would think that with the pegs and with the tiny little tail on the Devil Ray, things like that would snap off, but no, they're all fairly robust, and this guy is fairly easy to find on the aftermarket.
Now, Hydro Vipers make their first
really replace the Eels so much as they actually, as far as who it is. Well, that's all the time I have right now. Please check out my Facebook page for more information and behind-the-scenes photos for these reviews. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for next time to see another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review. See you then.
Always Form BX257, here to bring you another 1980s and 90s G.I. Joe tour review. And for my second Iron Grenadiers theme month, I'm going to be taking a look at Destro's Frogmen, the 1990 Undertow. I thought I would start off with this guy because it makes a nice segue between the previous month's Navy theme. Now, the Undertow doesn't make any comic book appearances in the old Marvel comic run, but he makes his first animated appearance in the deep animated G.I. Joe episode, Revenge of the Pharaohs. If you're wondering what an undertow is, I'm a little bit confused myself. I think it's a type of current that washes up on the shore or something. If you're curious, you might as well just Google it and see for yourself.
Taking a look at the Undertow's accessories first, his primary weapon is a trident. It's actually a very short trident with a very skinny shaft, which makes it a little bit difficult for him to hold it in his hands without having to wield it with both hands, but there's actually a reason for that, which I'll get into later. Next, he comes with a mask. Just take it off. And it's held on with a short 1.5 inch G.I. Joe standard wire, and it just plugs into the side of the rebreather portion and right onto his chest there. It's actually a very interesting looking mask, to be honest, because it only has one eye hole. Kind of a Deathstroke the Terminator vibe going on there. Not sure why you would obscure your vision like that, but hey. It's also a very thin and very flexible material. So while it's kind of sturdy, I can kind of imagine these things still being kind of broken fairly easily. Next, he comes with a pair of flippers. They're very high-tech and modern looking compared to what we'd seen before with the Eels and the Hydro Vipers. It's actually very nice. Goes with the color that he is overall, which is also very nice. It's not a contrasting color. Then he comes with what the contents list on the card calls a riding skiff. And on the bottom of this, it comes with a torpedo, which is just held in there with a peg. Obviously, this is some type of underwater jet ski type thing, kind of like a larger version of what the 1986 wetsuit came with. Now, here's a very interesting thing about the figure, is that he comes with it's very well designed and engineered. Because if you put his mask on, and then put the hose and connect it to his chest like you're supposed to. If you have him riding on here, the hose actually kind of gets in the way of him sort of lying flat properly. As a matter of fact, if you want him to hold the handles, I would actually suggest putting the hands around the skinny part of the bar rather than the actual grip. Because it's just a lot easier for him to angle the hands that way. Again, this is just one of those things where a swiveling wrist would have been really nice on these old G.I. Joes because of the way the accessories are sort of molded. But that's one of the other unfortunate things, is the figures and the accessories were probably molded by two different teams at Hasbro. So there might have been a bit of a miscommunication as to how these things go together. But one good communication thing is you can actually unhook it from his chest and hook it on to the riding skiff itself. So now that wire isn't really so much as in the way, but it's now a part of the riding skiff itself. And another thing, going back to the trident, if he's holding the riding skiff with both hands, where exactly does the trident go? Well, it doesn't say anything like this on the content of the card. It really would have been nice if there was instructions on here, but there isn't. You have to go by the artwork and see how this trident is actually just kind of sticking out of its back. In fact, his back has a very deep spinal ridge. So much so that it actually kind of opens up a hole between the torso portion and the waist piece. This is the one time which Hasbro actually took advantage of the sort of bad placement of how the hip and the torso meet. So you just use that portion, put it in there, and that's the storage. That's really neat. Again, this is something that a lot of collectors actually discovered well after the fact, and it would have been really cool if they had actually put instructions in there, but nope. You have to discover all this stuff for yourself. Well, last but not least, not really one of its accessories. I generally don't consider these animal friends to be accessories, but he comes with a barracuda. A very somewhat pliable fish here. Barracudas are known to be very large, very fast, and very aggressive fish with very sharp teeth. But they're not man killers. So while it's kind of cool in the sense of you know, barracudas being just sort of aggressive fish, I'm not quite sure why he has one instead of something like a shark or something. Well, I know I sort of complain about the color schemes of some of the Iron Grenadiers figures not really matching the overall tone of how it went before. The 1988 Iron Grenadiers had a very black, red, and gold color scheme matching throughout, except for the occasional fuchsia and beige for some reason. But that all gets thrown out the window in 1989, and 1990, it doesn't really help but very much either, although it does bring back that really dark red and some little black accents. But I can't overall complain about the color scheme of the Undertow because, well, to be honest, I think it looks very appropriate for Frogman, to be honest. It's really only the dark red which kind of throws everything off, and that's one of the Iron Grenadier staple colors, so I can't really complain. The actual color scheme on the figure is really well, and so are the paint apps. Like this portion, so sort of half stripe on his shoulder, actually goes all the way up. So it's a nice little continuation, which I don't think that they normally do on these figures. Just like the inside of his collar is picked out in black. That's another thing that I don't think Hasbro generally does. They usually cheap out on that sort of additional paint app. Without the mask on, he is a very plain looking face sculpt. But then he is a generic figure after all, so that's okay too. The Undertow is the first and only Iron Grenadier Frogman, or Navy figure in general, in the Iron Grenadiers line. And I think he does a really good job of it, so, well, I don't think he really needed an update. But at least to compare him to similar figures, we have the 1985 Cobra Eels, which shares the overall gray wetsuit paint scheme, though, with a little pop of red. That's very interesting that they went and copied that. What's even more interesting is that, well, we have the 1988 Hydro Viper, who is very monstrous, very sort of organic in design. So we have kind of things going a bit forward and then backwards as far as the villainous frogmen go. One interesting thing I do want to note is that for a primary weapon, the Undertow only has this trident. Now, I can just assume that this, fires off like electricity or something like that, like a stun baton or something like that. But it's not explicitly stated that in the on the file card or on the card listing. I don't think they even use these things in the cartoon, as far as I remember. Interestingly enough, you would think that the Hydro Viper, with all his demonic appearance, would have come with this staff, this trident, almost pitchfork-like trident actually. But he comes with this rather normal-looking harpoon gun. Should have really have switched that around. So who would the Undertow's primary rival from the G.I. Joe team be? Well, in the same year that he was released, we also have two G.I. Joe Navy servicemen. One of them being the 1990 Rampart, who is an air defense artilleryman, so I don't think that would be a proper matchup. But then neither is the 1990 Topside. He isn't a scuba diver either, but he is a Navy fighter, a Navy sailor, and I'm pretty sure that the Undertow would have to surface at some point, and these two could have a good match off there. But as far as a scuba diver goes, we have to go right back to 1986 for Wetsuit, and that's a little bit kind of old for a matchup. The closest we have is the 1989 Deep Six, who's a deep sea diver rather than a scuba diver. But I think that this matches up really well. I think the scuba diver equipment for the Undertow would actually allow him to go fairly well deep into Deep Six territory. If you're looking for an Undertow on the aftermarket, he is actually a fairly well-produced figure, so you should be able to find him complete with all of his accessories fairly easily. He's also not a very popular figure as far as all the other Iron Grenadiers go, so you should be paying a relatively low price for him. Now, I'm not quite sure why he isn't quite as popular as the other Iron Grenadiers figures. He's well appointed and I think he looks cool. But there are no other Navy or aquatic Iron Grenadier figures for him to go with, and certainly no vehicles for him to tag along on. So I guess he's just kind of that one-off figure that if you don't have him in your Iron Grenadiers collection, you're sort of not missing him either. Of course, the other main thing is that the mask is often missing with this figure, so that's really the primary thing that you really ought to look for if you're trying to find one complete on the aftermarket. The other 1990, the large use of dark red is pretty well matching with most of the Iron Grenadiers that were issued. Well, of course, the odd man out being the Annihilator, but we'll get to him in another review. I'm not sure if it gets broken or what, but I often find this figure.
Well, that's all the time I have right now. Please check out my Facebook page for more information and behind-the-scenes photos for these reviews. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for next time to see another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review. See you then. Hello everyone, I'm Kevin, otherwise known as Forum BX257, here to bring you another 1980s and 90s G.I. Joe tour review. And for this second Iron Grenadiers theme month, I'm going to be taking a look at Destro's anti-tank specialist, the 1990 Metalhead. Now, Metalhead makes his first comic book appearance in the Old Marvel comic run of G.I. Joe in issue number 114, where he is actually part of Cobra, but actually spying on them for Destro. And he makes his first animated appearance in the DiC animated G.I. Joe episode titled United We Stand, where, like a lot of the Iron Grenadiers shown in the DiC series, he works exclusively for Cobra and not for Destro.
Taking a look at Metalhead's accessories first, he comes with what the contents list on the card simply calls a gun. Doesn't have any special designation. And I don't believe it's based on any real-world military hand weapon either. Next, he comes with a removable helmet. It's a very large, bullet-shaped helmet. Very appropriate for a man named Metalhead, but also kind of odd, seeing as he never wore the helmet in either the comic books or the cartoons. Next, he comes with a two-piece missile backpack, the missile portion, as well as a frame. Well, it's called a frame on the contents list of the card, but it's called a shoulder brace on the instructions. And what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to be sliding this thing up along the frame and up over his shoulders. You still have to bend the figure over in order to get this horizontal properly, but it's still a really nice touch to be able to do that. And finally, he comes with a pair of leg-mounted missile packs. And you can actually swivel these things up and down. You can take them off completely. And as you can see, they connect to pegs on his thighs and a hole here. And they're doubly connected onto his back via this really long 6-inch wire. And his back also has pegs as well. Oops. These are actually 3-inch G.I. Joe standard hoses, not 6-inch. They're also curiously not mentioned on the contents list either, though. The leg missile packs and the backpack all feature the same missile. So there are 6 of these in total. The missiles also have a tiny hole at the back, and that's meant to aid in staying inside of the leg missile pack. As you can see, on the inside, it actually does have pegs. It's really not necessary for them to connect onto them in order for this thing to stay into the missile pack, but it does help sometimes, especially if it's a little bit loose, or if you're angling it downwards. These things do have a tendency to just sort of slide right out. And looking at the missile pack up close, even though they actually have non-symmetrical detail, both of the missile packs are exactly the same. So there's no left or right. Basically, one just looks upside down versus the other one. Kind of like the way the 1989 Rock and Roll had 2 of the same guns, even though he had to hold one of them on the right side and one of them on the left. And taking a better look at the missile backpack and its frame, the frame is actually quite detailed. Unfortunately, the frame doesn't actually lock into the missile portion pack, so you can just slide it off, both from the top rail and the bottom rail. You can see a lot of detail on the other side of the frame, which you really don't see because it is obscured by the missile pack itself. just taking a look at Metalhead without all of these accessories on him, which admittedly do obscure just the main figure, he is actually really nice. I like the sculpt. It's very detailed but practical with a lot of harnesses and stuff. And I really like the color scheme because it is mostly black with pops of red. And you could consider the yellow visor and maybe yellow rockets be part of the gold, which is really the standard of the Iron Grenadiers color schemes. But of course, he also has little pops of the light gray, which to me is perfectly fine because it represents the metallic look of his accessories. Taking a closer look at him, you'll notice that he actually has long hair which covers his ears, which is something that the comic books and the cartoons actually took advantage of, giving him kind of a wild haircut or kind of a mullet. However, I will say that he's actually missing a lot of paint apps. You'll notice that he has this red stitchwork going up the bottom portion of his legs here. And I think that these are supposed to be legs, not really boots, because I think the whole thing is supposed to be a blast suit. But that stitchwork actually continues up his legs, but they haven't picked those out in red. And it actually stops where this sort of clamp-like device is supposed to connect to the leg missile packs, but they haven't picked those out in gray like the rest of these portions of the connectors. As a matter of fact, a lot of the techno detail is actually really washed out because it isn't picked out in a lighter color. And continuing on with the red stitchwork, you can actually see that on the back of his arms. It's supposed to go down the back of his arms. Now, normally Hasbro doesn't color in the elbow portion. I don't think they really could. But you can see that it actually, the stitchwork actually does continue onto this portion right by his elbow. And they haven't picked that out in red either. I'm not too bothered about the non-continuation of the paintwork here. But there is one thing that, once I've seen it, it's really hard for me to ignore it. But the fact is that this red portion around his collar is actually supposed to go up like a turtleneck. And you can see that they've actually sculpted in the bottom of the turtleneck here, but they haven't painted that in. I really wish they would have just eliminated the red paintwork here and used that budget and moved it over here for his neck. But one good positive thing is that they've actually done the crosshairs on his goggles really well, which is actually something that they tried with the undertows. That's what the one eye thing on the undertow mask was supposed to be. It was supposed to have a crosshair on top of all that, but because of the rubberiness of the material that they used for his mask, it was kind of mushy and washed out, and I didn't really kind of notice it at first. But here, because of its much harder plastic, it's a really well done crosshairs, despite the fact that it's actually painted over twice, I think. While the Iron Grenadiers are an all-new army and sub-team, most of them don't take after anybody else, obviously, but that's not true in the case of Metalhead. There is a preceding figure for him. He takes after the 1984 Scrap Iron. Yeah, I know, a lot of people tend to think of Scrap Iron as actually being a Cobra. I mean, he goes with a Cobra symbol right there on his arm. But if you read his file card, he totally worked for Destro, and specifically for Mars. And that is basically what Iron Grenadiers are. They are employees of Mars and Destro's personal weapons testers. So who would Metalhead's opposite number on the G.I. Joe team be? Well, as the anti-tank trooper, he is most likely going up against any of the mechanized G.I. Joes or any of the individual tanks that there are. But if you wanted to go against a G.I. Joe who specializes in the same thing, obviously his opposite number would be the 1990 Salvo, the G.I. Joe's anti-armor trooper, who, in the comic books, they actually did face off against each other. So there is a genuine rivalry between these two. Oddly enough, most of the heavy weapon G.I. Joes actually have conventional handheld weaponry. So if you really want to compare Metalhead to somebody who actually had the weapons fixed onto his body, like an entire system, the 1987 Fast Draw is a good comparison. Metalhead comes with 14 individual parts in order to make him complete. So while that may sound like a really daunting task if you're looking for one on the aftermarket, I wouldn't have to really worry all that much because he is a heavily produced figure and all of its accessories are really sturdy. The only thing you might want to look out for is whether the backpack frame is included. Some people tend to forget photographing the underside of the backpack missile launcher, and they sometimes leave that on there, and it could be hard to see whether that part is still on there or not. It's just something to look out for rather than something that's often missing. It's just something that's often not photographed. So you do have to watch out for that. But Metalhead still commands a bit of a higher price on the aftermarket versus the other figures that he was contemporary with. One of the reasons, unfortunately, is even though he comes with a lot of accessories, they're fairly easy to find, and the accessories themselves are really sturdy, it's actually the figure which is very fragile. Unfortunately, these leg pegs are often broken off. And even worse than those are the pegs that are on his back. Because, again, sellers rarely take pictures of the back of the figure, so you can't even see whether the back pegs are broken off or not. But those are also fairly fragile. I'm sure that there's a fix for that, and I might make a fix video for any Metalhead figure which has broken pegs, but that's something that's in the future, and a lot of people really don't want to customize their figures or fix their figures. They want something which is basically untouched. In an effort to fix the peg breakage problem, later versions of the figures came with thicker and shorter leg pegs. Unfortunately, this came too late in production, and North American releases of the fix are rare, but standard on foreign releases. In the UK and Europe, the releases trailed behind North America by about a year. Hasbro UK saw the popularity of the spring-loaded gimmicks being introduced and decided to upgrade the 1990 figures upon second release. Metalhead's first release is the same as the North American version, but the second release includes the glider drone borrowed from the 1991 Cobra Commander. All the second release gimmick upgraded figures are popular with collectors seeking variants. And yes, these figures include the much needed thicker leg pegs, even though there's now nothing to connect them to. Metalhead's name was reused in 1995 for a good guy in the G.I. Joe Extreme series. Personally, I thought this was too soon to reuse a name, much less give it to a character of an opposing faction, since it was only a year apart from the 1994 Battle Corps Cobra version. rather ironic, seeing as taking a look at Metalhead without all of its accessories. Well, that's all the time I have right now. Please check out my Facebook page for more information and behind-the-scenes photos for these reviews. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for next time to see another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review. See you then. Hello everyone, I'm Kevin, otherwise known as Forum BX257, here to bring you another 1980s G.I. Joe tour review. And for my second Iron Grenadiers theme month, I'm going to be taking a look at Destro's Special Insertion Team, the 1989 Targat, which stands for Trans-Atmospheric Rapid Global Assault Trooper. Now, these guys don't make any comic book appearances in the old Marvel comic run, but they make their first animated appearance in the 1989 DiC animated 5-part miniseries Operation Dragonfire in Part 1. Taking a look at the Targat's accessories first, he comes with his primary weapon. As you can see, it's actually kind of clamped to his wrist there. And it is what the contents list on the card calls a laser gun. Now, this is actually a very small pistol for his main weapon. And as you can see, it is made out of gold plastic. But it's a flexible gold plastic so it doesn't succumb to gold plastic syndrome, which is where this thing would be really brittle and kind of easy to crack and break into tiny pieces. However, the wrist clamp, I guess, has a habit of wanting to go straight, or at least the cord does. So it can be a little bit difficult for it to stay onto his wrist or his arm. And if it doesn't, I wouldn't really fool around with this because, well, then you're straightening it anyway, and there's a possibility that it'll break anyway. Next, he comes with the contents list calls a joystick. Now, the joystick is attached by the standard G.I. Joe hose. It's about 6 inches long, and it's attached to his backpack on another peg like there. Now, the joystick, I would have thought would have gone like this, with the base at the bottom, but all the pictures I've ever seen have it facing this way. Kind of a shame, but I kind of like the look when it looks like this. It looks more like a joystick. It's actually kind of strange that this doesn't come with a wrist clamp. You would think that you wouldn't want the control arm for your jetpack to, fall out of your hands for some reason, but it doesn't. And finally, we have what the contents list on the card calls a shell. That's right, they're not calling this thing a backpack or jetpack, I should say. There's a lot of really nice detail on here, especially on the back, where you don't necessarily see it because the figure covers it. But as you can see, it has a little sculpted in ammo box and a trailing belt up to a barrel. When it's on the figure, I'm guessing this portion just fires over his shoulder. That's actually fairly interesting. So I guess that little pistol wasn't really his only armament. But one thing that you can do is you can spread the geared wings, and now it's a glider. Now you notice I don't really call this thing a jetpack either, because even though it does have jet exhaust here, it's actually on the top of the backpack rather than underneath, where you would think that most of the thrust should be if you're going this way. But there's actually a reason for this. In the file card, it is mentioned that he is deployed from orbit. So basically he falls through the atmosphere, rather a lot like a high altitude, low opening paratrooper. But in this case, he uses this as a heat shield against the atmosphere. On the file card, that's exactly how he uses it. That is basically his heat shield, and then it opens up into a hand glider. Basically, he doesn't use the wings when he's falling. He uses it like this, falling through the atmosphere, and that's what these jets are probably for, just to slow his descent. And when he gets to a probable height for attack, then he deploys the geared wings and glides to his target. As a matter of fact, it's actually better illustrated, oddly enough, in Dave Dorman's American Hero book, where he did artwork for pre-production for Hasbro. And here he did pre-production work for the Targat, and you can clearly see in the background that's how they do it. He's sort of scrunching himself up into the backpack and using that as the heat shield before deploying the wings and then popping out like this. And last but not least, he comes with a visor. Again, I would say that this was probably something that he would use during the re-entry process. And then when he pops out his glider and is ready to attack his targets, that's when he pops this thing open and you see, well, another face shield over that. You can take the visor off. It isn't pre-assembled in the package anyway. Now, as you can see, this is what his head sculpt looks like without the visor obscuring most of it. And unlike a lot of other figures like the 1989 Alley Viper and Night Viper, the pegs on the side of his head are actually kind of sturdy and thicker. So I'm not really worried about the pegs on the side of his head breaking off. I can't help but really like the Targat's color scheme and his overall sculpt. Especially his helmet with the visor and that pop of gold, which with his overall black color scheme and his pops of red and blue, even though blue isn't really a traditional Iron Grenadier's color, the red, black, and gold actually is. It's actually kind of funny that the gold is actually kind of hidden underneath there until you raise his main visor. But it's such a practical looking outfit, and it's really just done so much justice by the colors that they've used. And it's also really nice that he is one of the few figures that actually has the Destro logo. If I can zoom in here. The Destro logo on him. A lot of figures don't, and I'm not really sure why. Of course, he has a lot of nice little stitch work all over his outfit, just to emphasize that this is a heavily padded outfit. Again, that goes along with the whole idea that he's falling through the atmosphere, generating a lot of friction and heat. So he has to have that protection. But it doesn't have to be armor at the same time. It can be flexible, so he's maneuverable, just like a pilot or hang glider pilot should be. One thing I was specifically asked to look into when doing the review for the Targat was why he has this belt of grenades facing downwards. And the only thing that I can come up with is it doesn't really serve any practical purpose, but it's just there to emphasize the fact that he is not supposed to be vertical all the time. When he's using his shell heat shield thing, he's supposed to be kind of upside down and sort of crouched around here. I think that's what the upside down grenades are supposed to represent. I know a lot of people tend to think of the Targats as being jetpack troopers for Destro, and there's nothing wrong with that, especially with the look of his heat shield glider-like backpack. It really does look like a jetpack, to be perfectly honest. But in the same year that the Targat was released, we also have the 1989 Annihilators, who came with a helicopter backpack, or helipack, And these guys are really emphasized to be the airborne and recon troopers on Destro's side. So exactly what role does the Targat fill? I think that he fills the high altitude, low opening paratrooper role. So basically, he would be the equivalent to, let's say, the 1990 Free Fall. I think these would be really good rivals. But when he gets to the ground and deploys his glider wings, then he becomes the rival of the anti-aircraft guy, the 1989 Backblast. It's funny that I would pick two different rivals for this guy, but he does have two different, very distinct modes to his attack pattern. And here you can see the 1989 Targat with 1988 Destro and the Iron Grenadier soldiers, and you can see that they go really well together with their overall black color scheme. Now, it's true that the Targat does have some very loud pops of color, loud blue, and the red isn't quite as deep as it probably should be. But it looks far more like a 1988 figure than it does a fellow 1989 figure, using Darklon and the Annihilator here as examples. If you're looking for a Targat on the aftermarket, you'll be happy to know that he's a very heavily produced figure, and all of his accessories are fairly sturdy, so you should be able to find him complete and intact on the aftermarket fairly easily. But he is also a very popular figure among Iron Grenadiers collectors. A lot of people like army building this guy. Unfortunately, that does run up the price sometimes. But because he's so heavily produced, I would actually argue that you should really wait for a bargain, because he should be able to be found fairly easily. One thing that you do have to look out for, however, and it's kind of an easy fix anyway, is he can be discolored a little bit. He has kind of a light blue plastic head, which, as you know, light blue plastic on Hasbro figures, they tend to yellow a bit. Mine is actually kind of starting to do that on the top here. As you can see, as a contrast to the color of the visor, should be the same color, but it isn't anymore. Same thing with the backpack. The backpack, is being a light gray, it can discolor as well on the top. But that's an easy fix with a bit of hydrogen peroxide. Taking a look at the Targat's accessories first, we have this as you can see, the Targat actually, all of his accessories are very sturdy, so finding him easily on the aftermarket with a...
Well, that's all the time I have right now. Please check out my Facebook page for more information and behind-the-scenes photos for these reviews. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for next time to see another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review. See you then. otherwise known as Forum BX257, here to bring you another 1980s G.I. Joe tour review. And for my second Iron Grenadiers theme month, and the last Iron Grenadiers item I'll be looking at Destro's assault vehicle, the 1989 Razorback, with its drivers, the Wild Boars. Both the Wild Boar and the Razorback makes the first comic book appearance in the Ulmova comic run G.I. Joe spin-off, G.I. Joe Special Mission number 26. The Razorback in the main title makes a cameo appearance in the background of issue number 97, but both Wild Boars and the Razorback make a full appearance in issue number 101. Only the Razorback makes a cartoon appearance in 1989 DiC animated 5-part miniseries Operation Dragonfire Part 1, where it's mostly driven by Destro, fairly appropriately, but sadly the Wild Boars never makes an appearance in cartoon form. Taking a look at the Razorback first, it's actually a very large vehicle. Taking a look at its own driver, a 3 3/4-inch Wild Boars, you can see it has quite a bit of length there. Taking him out of the way for now, you can see that this thing is almost 14 inches long. Has a lot of very interesting features as well. We have 4 of these tracks. They look like tires, but they're actually called tracks on the blueprints, rather a lot like the 1988 Swamp Masher has. So there's 4 on each side, making 8 wheels altogether. Meaning that this thing rolls exceptionally well, and it's rather unhindered because it has a lot of space underneath. The front cockpit could hold 2 figures seated with these universal seat belts, which is what you got in a lot of 1988 and 1989 vehicles. There's no designated driver or gunner side, so you can use either side if you want. We have a really interesting little radar dish here. It can swivel all the way around, as well as hide away. It actually clicks into place, so that's not just some funny little error that they've made there. It actually does click into place up and down. I'll just leave it down for now. And on each side, we have these rotating missile points, which has 4 missiles on each side. The missiles are fairly interesting looking. They're very skinny. They're made of a kind of a bronze metallic plastic. I'm not sure if these will succumb to gold plastic syndrome, in other words being very brittle and easily snapped, but these seem fairly flexible, so I wouldn't worry about that. It's actually kind of interesting that they have little holes on the front fins, making it fairly easy just to string up a little bit of fishing wire and simulate these things firing off if you want to. On the back, we have another rather large antenna. It's on the same side as the other antenna sort of radar dish thing on the side there, making this slightly asymmetrical because of that. It also has an opening engine cover on the back here, which actually has cutout slats here for ventilation. You can see right through them. And you just take that right off, and you can see the engine detail, but only on one side. The other side is actually rather hollow. When I first got this toy, I actually thought I was missing something that was removable here, but no, it's actually just a storage compartment right beside the engine. That's very, very odd, but, well, it's storage, so you can't really complain about that. It also has a universal tow hook. The Iron Grenadiers didn't come with any towed vehicles, but I suppose you can simulate the Iron Grenadiers stealing a G.I. Joe, or a towed vehicle, or maybe even a Cobra towed vehicle like the Asp. And now to show the most prominent weapon on this vehicle, the one that I appreciate that's engineering the most, the bubble cannon. You can actually move the entire bubble around and up and down. Like the entire bubble actually moves, which is really cool that they've engineered it so it doesn't fall out of this little ring here. And you can just move it around. It's a little bit tight on mine, probably because of age, and it's a bit warped, but it does work, and it still works rather well and effectively. Moving all the way up and down, and all the way around if you want. Now you're probably wondering, if this thing is one whole bubble, how exactly do you get the gunner into that seat? But before I get to that, you'll notice that these gray arms have these points coming up, and they sort of break up the, I guess, the leanness of the vehicle. And on the box art of the toy, as well as the photograph of the actual toy on the back, which is the prototype toy that they've taken a photograph for the packaging, but still, even that photograph actually has those points sticking downwards. So you might be thinking, have I actually assembled this thing incorrectly? Well, no. Actually, the package art is incorrect. With the points looking downwards, the whole arm is actually very streamlined with the rest of the body and looks great that way. So if you have yours misassembled with the points facing downwards, I don't blame you. It does look good that way. However, that is just misassembled, and there's a reason why they stick upwards. Other than the fact that with the things sticking upwards, that's actually where the vehicle gets its name, Razorback. Razorback is a colloquial term for a spiked main boar, and boars have prominent underjaw tusks, which this is what it's supposed to represent on the vehicle. Now, with the points facing downwards, there's a couple of things that kind of go wrong here. And you'll notice at the very end here, if I can just get these wheels out of the way, you're not actually supposed to move these wheels out of the way, but they can be moved. You'll notice that there's a tab here, which rests on the side of the body. Now, if this were reversed, in other words, this arm is on the other side, so that this portion faces downwards, this tab is now up here. So when you articulate the arm, which I'll demonstrate in a second, it actually hits the body here instead of rest against it. And this is in its normal resting pattern. So it's actually resting against the body here. And you'll also notice that this isn't exactly smooth here either. It actually has a little bump and ratchet. And again, if this were reversed, that bump and ratchet thing would be all the way up here, connected to nothing, because, well, there's obviously nothing here, whereas there is down here. These gray arms have 2 points of attachment to the bodies, one there and one there, so they actually swivel the entire body inwards, like this. And the front wheels actually move forward to be in line with the back wheels. The back wheels, even though they do have a point of articulation, are not supposed to move. So with the front wheels swivel forward, and this thing ratcheted into its final position, the whole thing actually moves the whole bubble cannon upwards. Now you can still use this as a point of articulation, moving this thing around the way you want it to, up and down, so that you have far more height, and you can have the vehicle behind some cover, firing safely over that, if you want to. I think the instructions even mentioned the ease of putting the driver into the cockpit in this position, but I don't think that's really that relevant. It's actually more for access to the gunner seat. Now, the gunner actually has a swivel downwards, so you actually have to point the gun as much downward as you can just to alleviate the space for the hinge. And then you can fold this downwards and you have a lot of room just to put your figure into that seat. Now, again, if you had the arms in the correct position pointing downwards, you could articulate it a little bit, but not quite as much as this to give the seat as much clearance as it really needs for you to get a figure into there. Taking a look at the very seldom seen gunner seat, you can see it has two prominent joysticks on either side of the armrests, as well as a third universal seat belt, something that might be forgotten if you're looking for one complete. And of course, with this thing kind of folded up, the figure gets a little bit closer to the end of the cannon attachment, which has its own handlebars. That's very curious that they decided just to actually put two of them in here. Now, I'll have to be perfectly honest with you and say that the Razorback is not my favorite new Iron Grenadiers vehicle in my collection. While I do appreciate the amount of features which work well and the engineering it took to get those features to work, there's just a few things that really nag on me, like the amount of glass showing for the vehicle, the really awkward shape the vehicle has overall, and of course the pumpkin orange that this thing was molded in. These things are just things that really pop out at you at first before you get your hands on the toy. So while experience has actually told me that this is a really great toy, it doesn't really make for a good display sometimes, despite the fact that I can actually load this thing up with a lot of figures. On the back it has 4 foot pegs, which is something that the 1988 Demon did not have. It just didn't have the capacity to hold so many figures the way the Razorback does. And while the Razorback and the Demon share a lot of similar features, they both have missiles and cannons and the ability to elevate, the Demon also had the ability to dock Destro's despoiler on top of it, whereas this elevation only serves for more elevation for the bubble cannon and access to the bubble itself for the gunner. Still, it's a great toy, and I can see why so many people really like this thing. It just has so many fun little features on it. If you're looking for a Razorback on the aftermarket, they're actually fairly common to find, almost intact. There's really only one thing that you really have to look out for, despite the fact that it comes with a lot of rather smallish removable parts, like the rear engine cover, the 8 missiles, 3 seat belts, and of course this very large antenna. Now normally it's the antenna, which is fairly hard to find on the vehicles. They usually just pop out or crack off. But in this case, the antenna for the Razorback is actually very sturdy, so I wouldn't really have to worry about that too often. And if you do have one which is missing one, these will often pop up on the aftermarket just by themselves as a single part. You'll also notice that the missile, I guess, point arms actually pop off fairly easily themselves. So this might be something that you might have to look out for as a single part. But like I said, there's really only one part which is almost always curiously missing from a lot of the Razorback examples, and it isn't really something that you might think about. It's the bumper. For some strange reason, despite the fact that this thing has 3 attachment points, that's all it takes to remove the bumper. It's just a little upward movement, which is a fairly common thing if you're bumping this thing into a walls. Of course, this thing is going to just pop right off.
The wild boar driver has 2 accessories. The first is his removable helmet, which is attached to his forearm by this standard 3-inch G.I. Joe hose. Taking a look at his helmet a little bit more carefully, you can see that it almost has a plated look. It's very angular with those little plates, and they seem to be riveted on. It's a very interesting design there. You'll also notice that he has what looks like sculpted on goggles, but they can't be because the figure already has that. And on top of that, even if you put the figure's helmet as far forward as you can, it doesn't quite cover up his eyes anyway. So I don't think that that's what this is supposed to be. I think that this was supposed to be molded a little bit more forward, like the bill of a cap. Unfortunately, it's just molded down straight there, so it just kind of looks like it covers up his eyes. The figure also has a lot of interesting sculpting on it, which is rather unfortunately not picked out in paint. And the colors that they've chosen for the plastic, the sort of tomato red and the black, really washes out a lot of that detail, which is rather unfortunate. He has padding on his upper arm here. He has padding on the side of his legs, as well as on the front of the boots here. There's a lot of rather cool strapping harnessing going on all over his chest, but it's really hard to see because it's all just black. As a matter of fact, it's actually mirrored from his belt here with this kind of, I guess, O-ring holding it all together. And there's actually that O-ring right there, but it's really hard to see. One thing that they did pick out in paint, however, is this little tech detail on his right arm, which I always thought was a little bit strange because you'll notice that the peg for the wire, which goes up to his helmet, is on his left arm, which doesn't have any other detail at all. So I'm not really sure now what that wire was supposed to be for. I mean, it goes from his helmet, like some type of, I don't know, maybe some type of visual readout, to go to his left arm, which is hooked up to nothing. Well, I suppose you can just make up whatever you want for that. Some type of reflex enhancer, I don't know. Another interesting thing is, as you know, a lot of metallic paint on G.I. Joe figures, especially during the 80s, they tended to fade out quite easily and rub off quite easily. But right on this main strap here, you can't really see it. Well, maybe you can. But he has the Destro symbol right there on that strap. Mine is faded out because, of course, they painted it in gold. One unfortunate variation to the Wild Boars figure, and I do say unfortunate because it fixes something which wasn't necessarily a bad thing to begin with, but some versions of the figure do not come with the 3-inch G.I. Joe standard hose, but actually a 6-inch version. Now, I believe that was changed later on in production just because, like, when you move the arms around and stuff like that, it might just pop out because it's a little bit short. And this thing might just kind of strain on there. And it might strain it enough to break the pegs, either on the arm or the helmet. I don't really know, but here you can see what a 6-inch wire actually looks like. And as you can see, that is way too much. Despite the fact that the Razorback vehicle that he pilots has very non-traditional Iron Grenadiers colors, the figure actually does. Even though this is more of a tomato red, it's still more of an acceptable color than the pumpkin orange that the vehicle had. Just comparing them to the Iron Grenadiers standard soldier here, and even to the previous tank driver, the Ferret, you can see that they actually go all fairly well together. But one interesting experiment that I'd like to try is comparing him to the Annihilator. Now, the Annihilator has orange and purple, which I think actually goes very much well with the Razorback, rather than the pilot that it's designed for. So one thing that I'd like to try is to swap their roles. And here is Wild Boars with the Annihilator's backpack. And to be honest, he looks more like a evolution of the Iron Grenadiers Trooper than the Annihilator certainly did, if that's what the whole Destro's Elite Trooper subtitle is supposed to imply. The color scheme just looks quite a bit better on this guy. And here's Annihilators driving a Razorback. And you can see how the purple actually pops very well with the pumpkin orange of the Razorback's cockpit. Like I said, it's almost like these two are switched. One neat variation of the Razorback to look out for is the one released in the UK and Europe. As I mentioned in my Metalhead review, Hasbro UK upgraded their figures with spring-loaded missile launchers. This upgrading extended to some 1989 and 1990 vehicles, such as the Razorback. Also, check out the orientation of the articulation arms. They're correct due to this being a later photo than the North American packaging.
One very interesting thing to note is that last year I actually ran a poll because this would be really the only Iron Grenadiers vehicle I wanted to buy for this year. And this was a poll between the Razorback, obviously, Darklon's Evader motorcycle, and the 1990 Destro Dominator, a vehicle which did not have a driver. And while the Destro Dominator didn't really have a lot of votes, it was actually pretty close between the Razorback and Darklon's Evader. Well, that's all the time I have right now. Please check out my Facebook page for more information and behind-the-scenes photos for these reviews. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for next time to see another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review. See you then. Hello everyone, I'm Kevin, always known as Forum BX257, here to bring you another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review, and this is it. This is one of the most highly requested reviews I've gotten since, well, doing the USS Flag, the Terrordrome, and even the Defiant Space Shuttle. It's the G.I. Joe's huge, heavily armed battle wagon. the 1988 Rolling Thunder, and its driver, Armadillo. Now, both the Rolling Thunder and Armadillo make no cartoon appearances, but the vehicle itself makes its first comic appearance in the old Marvel comic run of G.I. Joe in issue number 76. Armadillo, however, makes his first appearance in issue number 80, but in that issue, and throughout his appearances, he's always referred to as Rumbler, which is, well, quite frankly, a little bit confusing, because while it might have been his prototype name, it was the name given to another character who never made an appearance in the comic books. Uh-oh. The Rolling Thunder is a massive vehicle. It's around 13 inches wide by about 14 inches high with the antenna, but it's a whopping 28 inches long, including the front chin cannon here. But that's only its compact transport mode. It gets even larger in its alternate mode, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let's first take a look at the front end of the Rolling Thunder. First, we'll take a look at the chin cannon, which only elevates that much, but depresses quite a bit. As a matter of fact, it can go just a little bit further down like that, and can swivel more than sideways. So if the 28-inch length is not to your liking, you can actually get rid of about 3 inches worth of length just by pushing the cannon out of the way. Next, we have the opening windshields.